And most of the officers that came out there were trained as engineers. But that came into play in warfare as far as, selecting the high ground and where the rivers were and how you could build defenses and how you could attack. And there were 217 future Union generals fought in the Mexican War, and 146 future Confederate generals fought in the Mexican War, as well as over 800 other soldiers, officers, and stuff had fought in the Mexican War for the North, and 300 some fought for the South. So everybody has this kind of similar background. In fact, through the war and the West Point connections, a lot of these people knew each other. They were good friends, and they served together. Some right up until the Civil War started, and all of a sudden, you have to make a choice, whose side you're going to be on. And I don't know if they've ever figured out if it worked out good or bad for everybody. Some of them were really good friends, all through the war, and were friends afterwards. But having this kind of common background in the Mexican War and knowing a lot of people from West Point, it was like, okay, I know Joe pretty well. This is probably what he's going to do on tactics. So I'll have my men, my army do this to counter. And sometimes it worked and sometimes it didn't. You couldn't, always predict what somebody you knew was going to do because the situation was different. But obviously that the personalities of all the major leaders involved were with that. Jump on me. Okay. So there were, this was in place and things were, just leading up. Okay, thank you. Obviously slavery enters in. It's a big part of this manifest destiny thing. And one thing we can't quite put our finger on today, I don't think, is that states' rights were so powerful at that time. The Union, as we know, was only like 60 years old, or so after 70 at most. And a lot of these people at that time had parents that fought in it or some grandparents. And the idea that this loose grouping of all these states was more powerful than the separate states, goes back to the separate colonies. So states' rights were still really, really big with everybody. And, it's hard, for me anyway, to comprehend that if a big thing happened in the U.S. that I would stick with Iowa instead of the whole country. But back then, that's not where the feelings were. So we look at these people that, that went to the South, boy, they were really traitors to their country. Well, their state was more important than the country. Jefferson did not want to be the president of the Confederacy. He skipped the convention. He was a West Point grad military engineer. He wanted to be in the Army. So he skipped the convention after the state seceded, and he was there, and everybody says, hey, let's have him do it. And so he's really disappointed in that. And later that probably affects us out because he starts running the war as president as a general. And took a little away from his general's ability to do things. And Robert E. Lee was contacted by Lincoln and offered the command of the Union Army. And he said, I have to think about it. He went back home in Virginia and thought about it. His father was a big Revolutionary warrior and everything. But that state sentiment, he said he could not turn his back on Virginia. He had to go with Virginia. And so a lot of people were convoluted by that. So as we're getting closer to the actual outbreak of the war, things start warming up even more. This new territory out there from Mexico and stuff, the southern states, manifest destiny, they want to be able to move out this way and have their lifestyle, slavery and stuff. The northern states want to go out here and all this, and they want to have no slavery there. And, you have the compromises and different legislation. that doesn't really help. It just makes people argue more. And during this 1850s, mid-1850s, leading up to the Civil War, that area is called Bleeding Kansas. And it was a lot of guerrilla warfare. Missouri had a lot of slaves, but they also had a lot of people that didn't like slavery. And in times leading up to the war, a lot of activities going on there. John Brown, one of the major operators down there, was an abolitionist from out east. He had preached his abolitionist policies and was fighting that. And then the other hand, you have somebody like Quantrell, William Quantrell, who was a Southern sympathizer, and he was, attacking and burning farms of people that were anti-slavery. So you have this stuff going on. Jesse James' older brother Frank was involved in that late on, and he joined the war right away, and he fought against the Iowans down at Pea Ridge, that battle down there, and he was wounded later in the war and took an amnesty. They would release you if you were a prisoner if you swore allegiance to the Union. So he set out the war for a couple of years, and then when things started to heat up again, he renounced his oath and went back down, joined Quantrell, and became a guerrilla, fighting against the anti-slavery northern people. But, ragtag groups of people, and, they would loot, rob, burn, pillage, and, intimidate. The extremes were the killings and stuff, but they would intimidate people. Hey, it starts getting warmer. We have Harper's Ferry. That same John Brown. Been an abolition out there, so you're very, very familiar with that part of the country. And after he came out of Missouri, after the tough time, the real high points of the Kansas conflicts, spent a lot of time in Iowa, southern Iowa, and a little further up. And he decided that he would raid the federal arsenal in Harper's Ferry, Virginia, which he was very familiar with. So at that point, he decided to grow his beard long so people wouldn't recognize him because he was a pretty well-known figure. But I don't know if it worked well. I think if I was getting on a train in Keokuk, heading out east back then, and this guy hops on with those wild eyes, I think I would notice it. And so he didn't really go unnoticed. Actually, when he was in Iowa, he recruited the Coppock brothers, Barclay and Edwin, and they were from just north here. Whether it's at Riverside or was there Springdale. They were from Springdale. They were from Springdale, and they had been out east, and they moved out to Iowa. And then when John Brown started getting active here, they were familiar with him, and they believed his abolition ideas and stuff, so they joined up with him. And 2 days in October '59, they attacked the federal arsenal there. John Brown had been talking to slaves and stuff like that, and he thought they would break into the arsenal, get all the weapons, and arm all these black slaves that had rebelled against their owners, and they would force emancipation to take place. At that time, Robert E. Lee was the Union commander that was sent there to quelch the raid, and they barricaded it, and eventually, in like 36 hours of barricading it, they won. Brown was captured, put on trial a couple days later and hung. Edwin was captured there and hung. Barclay got away and came back eventually to Iowa, and the federals wanted him on charges out there with the Iowa governor. I think Dodge at the time was abolitionist and stuff too, said, no, we're not going to turn him over. So he stayed here. As the war started, he got involved and he joined a Missouri group of soldiers. But as he was heading back to northern Missouri to join up, his group with other ones, the Confederates had found out about it, and they minded a railroad bridge, and he was killed in the train accident there. But while he was there, he was in there, and he had Robert E. Lee in his sights. And he asked John, he said, hey, you know, there's their commander there, I can take him out. And John Brown said, no, that's not the way we do things. We're not going to kill the leaders. So he didn't shoot. Robert E. Lee lived. John Brown obviously knew this was going to be a big news-breaking thing. So he invited Dred Scott, one of the most eloquent black speakers and abolitionists of his day, but smart man. He thought, hey, I don't think this is a real good idea. So he declined the invitation to join. Harriet Tubman, also very outspoken abolitionist, highly respected. She was sick, so she said, oh, I can't take part in it. But good for them because it ended in disaster. And ironically, the first person killed was a free black man that was working for the railroad in Harper's Ferry. And I think he had 2 of his sons were killed at Harper's Ferry with him, 3 or 4 black recruits he had there, and some of his other ones, and a few of them escaped. Okay, a little too long on that one. Okay, starts getting hot when Lincoln's elected. Now the South really starts to worry with this guy that they think is anti their way of life. So when Lincoln gets elected, these dark green southern states secede from the Union, form their own government. And they say, you know, we can't abide by what's going on up there, so they're following that, manifest destiny, get rid of the Indians, Revolutionary War concept. Hey, you know, we will fight for our freedom. And it's kind of a different take from their side than from the North side. The North wants to preserve everybody, and they're not like the way things are going, so they think it's their right to secede. So, you know, for a few months, you know, it worked out. Things were kind of tense, and people were talking, and this and that, and the Southerners, you know, confiscated weapons and all the arsenals and stuff, and there was a lot of talk and bluster, and nobody thought, you know, it was going to be messed to clean out, but not a whole lot was going to happen. But then, well, before that, excuse me. No, that slide is good. So at that time, after Lincoln's elected, before the war starts, this is what's in place. The North has population 21 million. The South, 9 million, but 4 million were slaves. The North economy is industrial. They have well laid out grid of transportation, good railroad connections, and, you know, pretty good roads, infrastructure, bridges and stuff. And they operate on a paid labor system. The South, in the meantime, is agriculture. They're agrarian. Crops. Cotton is their big one. Their infrastructure, that is way behind. They had railroads, not nearly the miles of railroads in the North, but on top of that, a lot of railroads at that time, they were local railroads. You know, somebody had started a railroad from Tipton to Davenport, and had exchange like that. And then from Tipton going west, or from Davenport going east, or north or south, you would transfer to another railroad. So you had all these local railroads, and back then, they didn't necessarily keep the same track width. They would order engines to run the track this way and go to Davenport. Davenport, they had to be unloaded off to another train, and in the North, the trains had the same track width. So trains could go all over. But in the South, when you got to the end of that particular train line, you have to switch cargoes to the train that could fit on those tracks and go the next 100 miles or so. So that really limited. And with a labor force based on forced labor, you don't have the same kind of backing, same kind of enthusiasm as a population like the North did. Okay. So the flashpoint, that happens here. Fort Sumter, everybody's heard about that. April 1861. The South had taken over all the things down there. Fort Sumter was still a federal arsenal out in the bay, and the Confederacy had asked for them to remove the troops. That was Southern Territory now, going north. The U.S. government and that refused. They tried to bring ships in to replenish them, and the ships were turned back. But on this day, the South fired a cannon shot, and they kept it up for 34-hour bombardment. In that time, there were about 80 people in the fort. There were about 500 Confederates at the different forts. They were all around this. This was out in the water. They had different batteries, so they were shooting from all directions. And this meant like the South fired over 3,500 cannon shots at it. The North probably fired 1,500 cannon shots back at it. The only damage was a couple of Union soldiers got hurt a little bit by brick and stone flying off. Later, the Confederates sent incendiary things that started to burn some of the wood structures inside. And then the commander, realizing that he could not get resupplied, decided that he would give up the post. I got a little baseball in here because probably you don't know Abner Doubleday, who's later credited with starting baseball. He was an officer there, and he fired the first Union shot back in the Civil War. And later he was a pretty big player as a general at Gettysburg. Big influence with the Union movements there. So all the action stops. The Union commander, Anderson, requests to the Confederates that, hey, we're going to abandon the fort, but could we have permission to do a 100-gun salute, for leaving the post? Confederates said, yeah, sure. So during the Union firing their 100-gun salute, one of the guys is killed with cannon shot right, and another gets really injured, dies the next day. And then so a couple days later, when the news goes out, well, the Confederates fired on that. We got 2 dead. People are killed. We're really bad now. And just misinformation. And any of that sound familiar in this day and age? Next. So right away, when that happened, war is declared. All connections with the South are officially cut off. They're not delivering mail back and forth. You can't go down to see your relatives. They can't come up here. And they put a call to arms. We want recruits. And Iowa really stepped up to the forefront. They were some of the quickest ones to volunteer. The 1st and 2nd Iowa regiments were basically in-place militia units, and they just were basically rented out by the governor of Iowa to the Union Army. And, this was going to be a little push and shove, get your fancy uniforms, parade out of town, go down, fire a few shots, war's over, and we parade back into town. That's what everybody thought. So war started out 3-month enlistment. Everybody thought, we're going to be home less time than that. And all the young guys, this time probably the average person had probably never gone more than 20 miles from where he was born. So for a lot of the unmarried young Iowans, man, this is a good chance to get out and see the world, just frisk it out a little bit, have a fancy uniform, come back to the girl that I was too shy to talk to. Now they got a uniform, I'll be cool. Obviously, we know it didn't work out that way. But down there, over 76,000 Iowa men ended up serving. That's basically 75% of the eligible military age guys in Iowa were out of the state for a while, which huge impact on the home front. They had a total of 44 infantry companies, 9 cavalry, and 4 artillery units. And, Union artillery had 6 cannons per battery, so they would have had 24 cannons doing that. And this guy from Bloomfield was one of the first. I think he's Bloomfield. The photo was Bloomfield. I couldn't find other, and he was in the 2nd Iowa Regiment, served in Atlantic Carolinas and stuff, and got through. And the first 3 training camps were set up along the Mississippi, because after they were trained, they would get on the steamboats, go south, off the Mississippi. A lot of them, next station was down Benton Barracks in Missouri, and in St. Louis. And with the 1st regiment that they got, which was kind of in place already as a militia, but to get them equipped as meagerly as they did, and some weapons to them and stuff, and get them to the dock in Keokuk, cost the state $39,000 for 1 regiment. So, first thing people realized, hey, the war, it's going to take money. And at the time, the major currency stuff was local banks. Basically, there were no regulations on printed money. If you had a business, an insurance company, and you had $1,000 in savings, you could basically print $1,000 worth of money on the promise that if somebody brought it, to your office, your company, you would give them, a silver dollar or 2, half dollars. And so you have these just all over. This is from Iowa City. I got some here that you look at are from Lyons, which is now part of Clinton. But during war, what happens? Coins start being hoarded. Solid currency. In the ancient days, a lot of things were bronze, and they had bronze coins in that. But if you have enough bronze coins and things get bad, what do? You melt it down, make a sword or knife out of it, protect yourself, and you can fight. So they were converted. So people start hoarding money, the hard money. And surprisingly, the United States government did not print any paper money up until the Civil War. In 1862, they came out with the first paper money, other than what private people were doing. And buying stamps, which was the only way to communicate back then. You didn't have, phones, radio, you did not have iPhones. So mail was the only way to keep in touch with back home and that. So the government also started out printing fractional notes. And the idea with these, get those in circulation, you could go to the post office, exchange that for a 3-cent stamp, and mail your letter. But they started getting used for everything. Tokens. A lot of individual places, big grocery stores, big department store chains would mint their own coinage. And a lot of them had takeoffs of the Liberty, off the Liberty had pennies. Then on the back they had, advertising for the store. You bring that to their store and it's worth a penny. But those just started circulating all over. I don't think anybody ever really took them back to the store to get, pennies worth of merchandise that they circulated. Things were tight, so they started even taking stamps. This is a 10-cent stamp, I believe. I can't see real well from here. And they would crimp those in little tin things. They would put a little piece of mica, the natural little sliver mineral, little piece of mica over that, and crimp these around it. I think, man, today, you go and you have a bunch of tokens, like, what do they cost you? All that for, to wrap around a 3-cent or a 10-cent stamp. But those served as currency. But they decided, hey, that's not enough. So they started putting taxes on photos. Photography had just become popular. We'll get more to that later. So here's the backside of these cards where they have the revenue, special revenue tax stamps printed. This is an interesting one because it's got a regular U.S. postage stamp on it, which technically it's illegal use of a postage stamp. But, you know, it's 3 cents and tax is 3 cents, so they just okayed it. And it got to the point that partway through the war, they talked about it about 1862, and it was probably about 1863, Lincoln imposes the first income tax in the U.S. And good, bad, whatever, because the Civil War, it's still with us. So the Civil War, I mean, it was a big deal. We think it was over and done with, but the repercussions that come to us today are still surprising. Down in the South, same thing. They have their local banks, and currency was iffy thing. There's a lot of counterfeiting. Plus, the further away you got from where you could redeem it for real money, the less it was. You're out here in Iowa and you get a banknote from the Cleveland Bank. Somebody wants to buy $5 worth of your corn and hands you a Cleveland Bank $5 bill, and you look at it. Yeah, I'm not going to get Cleveland to get five silver dollars back. I don't know if I can buy something for Mike, and he will take this, and then I will have what I want, and it's up to him to trail it off. So the further away you got from those home banks, the less and less people trusted that currency. And sometimes they would say, well, you got $1 from that, I'll give you 90 cents for it, credit on what you buy. But the one thing, the big bank in New Orleans had been there a long time, because that part of the country was settled way before, Missouri and Iowa and Illinois upriver. And they had a very, very stable banking system. Their currency had been in circulation for probably 30 years by this time. So it was good as gold, basically. And New Orleans is bilingual, so they had English on one side, or they had French notes and English notes. The $10 note on the back, Dix, French for 10, and since their money was so highly regarded, people from, that were from that area and stuff, they'd come up to Iowa to visit, they're from Georgia. Oh, you're from the land of the Dixes, where the good money is. So that's where Dixieland came from. And it referred to the stable currency that existed there before the war. And again, once the war started, they started printing money. The first 4 issues of Confederate money were printed in New York City between the time that the first group of states broke away and the war started. And then after that, they had to rely on their own printers. And the states had money. Here's a quarter from North Carolina. Here's a 50-cent piece of paper from South Carolina. All the states had their currency. Southern banks had their own thing. Here's the 1864 issue, the last issue of Confederate money. Those are the common ones. If you've ever seen a Confederate note, that's probably what you have seen. Interestingly, shortly after they started printing money, they became interest-bearing notes. So when you got a note at the bank or post office, wherever, they were stamped. This note was issued, here. And every year, on January 1st, you could collect interest on this. So this particular note, I got one there that's traveled 3 times, but it, I don't know what the percent was, but when the new year came, you could take it to the bank, you could get money for it, you could save your $100 bill, and they would stamp it so nobody else could redeem it, save it for another year, they would stamp it so it wasn't renewable again. So, I don't know if interest-bearing banknotes were around before that or not, but they popped up in the Civil War. Another thing the Confederacy did was printed bonds. And bonds are, future payment. And most of them were backed by cotton. And they tried to sell most of them to Europe. they weren't going to sell them to the north, therefore, and people in the south didn't have money to buy them. So one of the mistakes the South made at the start was during that few months between the secession and Fort Sumter is they kind of held their cotton. They said, hey, we'll let the price rise a little bit, then we'll have Europe, France, especially Great Britain, buy it at a little better price. But unfortunately, we'll get to things that didn't happen. Another thing, counterfeiting was a big problem all over, in the north and the south and stuff. And these are both counterfeit Confederate notes. And then there was a guy named Samuel Upham in Philadelphia. He had a little stationery shop. And early in the war, somebody brought him in and said, hey, son or dad, somebody came back from war and, had this Confederate note here, what do you think of that? He said, So he started making them as souvenirs. And, we could sell them, souvenir of the rebellious states. And when they first came out, he would print down here that, facsimile Confederate note, Samuel up in Philadelphia. And then the serial numbers and that were printed in. All the other money, all these other banks we've been talking about, they were all hand numbered and hand signed, usually by two people. And some of the counterfeits are really bad, and some are really good. But you also have to remember that a lot of people couldn't read. And, if you can't read, it's hard to tell, if something's legitimate or not. But then they could tell, okay, this is printed, this is not written in ink, so that was a giveaway. But then some people started coming to Upham and said, hey, Sam, I have an idea. Could you print me $20,000 worth of Confederate money, put a facsimile label on, and leave these blank? Sure, I'll do it for money. And the people would take those, they would write in serial numbers, they would sign names, make them look authentic, and they were smuggled in the South and, used down there. And there are some people that credit Samuel Upham with a huge factor in winning the war. When the war started, you had the Confederate dollar. By about 1863, the Confederate dollar was worth about 33 cents. By heading into toward the end of the war, 1865, it was worth about 2 cents. If you could find anybody that would even take it for 2 cents on the dollar. And part of that was, money's probably not real good from the government, let alone if this is a counterfeit one. So, okay, so with all this, here are some of the islands, fairly local. And if we have time, we'll get back to them. If I get a little long-winded, we won't see these again. But just take a minute here, relax, and just look up there. A lot of these are tin types, especially ones where, they would put the little pink chinks painted on it sometimes. And sometimes they would, put gold on the things like that. So, back then, that's a color picture back then. But just look at it and just think that, okay, there's a brother up there, there's a son, there's an uncle, there's a husband, there's a grandfather, and they're going off to war. What are your thoughts? What are your feelings? How are you approaching this?
With sadness.
Some, number of them were unmarried, guys, so that was, wow, a big adventure. But, all the mothers who were left behind with kids to take care of. And like I said, over time, 75% of the 18 to 45-year-olds were out of the state. And the women were running things here. At
the beginning, you were so anxious.
Oh, they were. They loved the uniforms and the parades, and a lot of them had the militia uniforms, and some of those were just gaudy fancy. Some were styled after the French Zouaves, with the puffy pants and the little North African hats and the tassels and the stripes. I mean, they look like clowns, you know, fighting the war. That's what you would never think they would do. You know, I like this guy. Jaunty's, you know, he's, hey, top of the world, man. This is going to be great. And for him, it was. He was a cook for a colonel, so never saw action and had good food to eat because he, I'm sure, fixed the colonel's food. He took as much of that good food as he could. Okay, next one. Surprise, we have somebody here that later had a relative. Where are you, man? I forget. Yeah, right here. He had a relative that was a graybeard in the Civil War. They recruited, you had to be 45 years or older to do that. I think the oldest was this guy. I think he served as a graybeard at age 80. And there was one regiment of 37th Iowa were the graybeards. And they went to Alton, Illinois on guard duty. Then later they were sent to Rock Island Arsenal prison up here. It was just kind of the new wave of prisoners were coming in. They were there for about 6-7 months, but that's when the smallpox, that's when tons and tons of Confederate prisoners died there. And Margaret Mitchell in Gone with the Wind, they talk about that. This is Scarlett's sister and Ashley Wilkes, you know, that Scarlett had the hot score instead of Clark Gable. Anyway, in Gone with the Wind, she, they're worried he gets sent to Rock Island Prison. And, you know, at that time, down it was considered the Andersonville of the North. They were all bad, but anyway, so, you know, that's what I like about this, these connections. This is a picture taken at Rock Island Arsenal Prison, and these are Confederate soldiers, and they have done something they shouldn't have done. So they had punishment called riding the rail, and it was just a narrow board, and they would have to go out and sit on it, you know, for a couple, 3 hours. You know, can you imagine with, you know, the hearts and, you know, the heat and the bugs, and if you goofed up there, you probably got a double sentence, whatever. Okay? Another surprise, maybe. We had one regiment of Afro-American troops. They were called the Volunteer Regiment of African American Descent. It was all started by Alexander Clark, who was from Muscatine. At that time, Muscatine had the highest black population in the state. There was about a little over 1,000 people of color in the state at that time. And Alexander Clark organized this, recruited it, and in time, I think they had over 1,000 black soldiers in this regiment, but most of them were from Missouri. And so we can't take a whole lot of credit. At that time, at the start of the Civil War, Iowa was the whitest state in the Union. The legislature of Iowa and the territory in 1833 had rules. No escaped slaves were allowed to come in from Missouri. You know, free blacks. It was not real comfortable for you to come here. They had all kind of other rules and legislation in place to make Iowa not an attractive place for pieces of color. And so, like I said, here, you know, we have basic, just like 1,006 or so black residents of Iowa during the Civil War. But they fought gallantly, and, you know, some left their families and wives at home. They were proud. Early on, they were subjugated to, you know, cooking duty, doing the supply wagons, cleaning up the battlefields, burying the dead, and, you know, work nobody else wanted to do. Later on, as the war progressed in probably 64 and 65, a lot of them got involved in combat, and as a rule, they were as good, if not better, than the white troops, because they had a little more something to prove. Clark later on, late in his career, he was appointed ambassador to Liberia, where before the war, freed slaves had been sent to start a new African colony. Also, he was an attorney, and a couple years after the war, he filed the first successful lawsuit against public schools and made the public schools accept a black suit, which, you know, for Iowa at the time was pretty daring. Another surprise, probably about 20% of people in the Civil War were kids, 16 or under, doing different things. Drummers, a lot of them behind the scenes doing things. Couple of most famous ones, Frederick Grant, Ulysses' son. Grant was a pretty good family man. Early in the war, he kept contact. He would take furloughs to head up north and visit his family. And his wife and kids would come down and be near the forts when they were out on the march. His son Frederick accompanied him to get Vicksburg, and Frederick was out on the deck on the gunboat coming down the river, and Confederates fired, and a big cannon shell went right across the boat in front of him. So he and his dad got down inside. Not that that would have been a whole lot of protection, but at the siege of Vicksburg, he was in his dad's tent, and a courier came in with a letter, and Grant opened it and said, "Vicksburg has agreed to surrender." So Frederick was the first one other than Grant to know they had won Vicksburg. He ran out to the camps yelling, you know, "We got Vicksburg, we got Vicksburg." But the war apparently did not have a bad effect on him. He went on to West Point and served, took a break, civilian stuff, and then he joined up again. And I think in the late 1890s, when he retired from the military, he was the second highest ranking military officer in the U.S. military. This is an Iowan, John Henry Dyckman, nicknamed Buster, and he accompanied the troops and actually was under fire and stuff. Drummer boys usually stayed back, beat the drums to control the troops, but sometimes they got caught up in it, flanking actions, whatever. Ones in the Navy were called powder monkeys. And there we had a jaunty, pretty confident looking young powder monkey. One of the most famous ones was Johnny Clem. And he was, I think, out of Ohio. And his mother died when he was 8, I think. So he left home. And at 9, you know, the war was going on. And he went to these different army camps to join up. And they just said, "No, sorry, son." Finally, the 22nd Michigan Regiment said, "Okay, we need a mascot. You can be our drummer boy." And he became the drummer boy, and he at Chattanooga, I think, he actually got into fighting, and he is credited with, there was a Confederate colonel that was near there, and Johnny Clem shot him, did not kill him. Some claim that he killed the Confederate when he was cannon, but at most he did wound him, but he was in battle, and he was wounded a little bit, but recovered. He was nicknamed Johnny Shiloh, little drummer boy, Johnny Shiloh, but their regiment never fought at Shiloh. The action that he got at Chattanooga that got him his fame. But again, you know, with him, the war did not have a detrimental effect. In 1870, 5 years after the Civil War, he graduated from high school, went to West Point, went into the military, and he was out for a little bit, then he joined up again, and he served over 44 years in the military. And when he retired in 1915, he was the last Civil War veteran that was still serving in the military forces for the United States. Okay. Another surprise. We have about 76, at least, young Iowa boys that fought for the Confederacy. Dubuque was called the Copperhead capital. You had Northerners and Southerners, pro-slavery, anti-slavery, states' rights, union rights, going back and forth. And kind of in the middle, you had the Copperheads. And their big thing was they didn't want war. Let's keep the peace. You know, if we got to make concessions, let the South leave. We're better off without them anyway, and this and that. And they kind of adopted liberty, you know, as their symbol. You know, the country is formed on the principles of liberty and stuff. So if the South wants to break away, that's their right. Let's get rid of them, and we can do what we want up here. So the Liberty had pennies were a big thing in that. So they started calling them Copperheads because of the copper liberty things, and then with Copperheads, then it soon became the Copperhead states because they're nasty and stuff. So you're the Copperheads threatening the Union and stuff. And Dubuque at the time was the Copperhead capital of Iowa, with trade, and some southern people had moved there, and the ancestors of the Hempstead families was in Dubuque Hempstead High School, and I don't know which generation of family, but two of the Hempstead boys went south and fought for the Confederacy. Okay, at the time this all breaks out, we have old Winfield Scott, and he was old, veteran of the war, 1812, big hero of the Mexican War. That's why, after the Mexican War and all that stuff, that's why we have Scott County, Iowa, named after him. In Iowa, we have Winfield Township. He was a big hero, and a lot of places in the new frontier, you know, from 40s, 50s on up to the Civil War, were named after all these successful generals and leaders in the Mexican army. And he was in charge. He was 74 at the time, and he came up with what he called the Anaconda Plan. Early in 1861, he said, what we need to do to be successful is we need to surround the Confederacy with a tight anaconda-like grip. That means we got to control the Mississippi, we got to control their harbors, so they can't do trade, they can't get supplies from Europe or other places, cut off South American coffee supplies and different things like that. And then the last part of the state is the northern states. And shortly after that, he had to retire. He just couldn't do it. The first thing that these, and you know, here we have, you know, cartoons. There was a good sense of humor in the Civil War. A lot of cartoons, editorial cartoons, and here's Winfield, you know, fighting off the different things, secession, and these all have different names of like Southern type stuff, and this fighting a many-headed snake, and you know, going back to the Revolution, tying all this patriotism in. So just again, so many connections. Okay, sorry. One of the first stops, Camp Warren in Burlington. So after these young soldiers signed up, they would be sent to a training camp, and most of them, from where they were in Iowa, walked there. A huge number of the troops on both sides showed up to training camps without shoes. Most of the farm kids and stuff, you know, didn't wear shoes. And in the training camps, they would do marching drills on end. They would put on guard duty, even though they were in the northern parts. But just all kind of training. They would get them up before dawn, drill for a couple hours, quick lunch, drill for 2 or 3 hours in the afternoon, then put on a little parade for the commanders. Lights out at 8 o'clock. Officers could lights out at 9. They were up 4:30 the next morning doing it again. And they worked, but they camped throughout the open. Some of them had time to build wooden structures eventually. Obviously, officers always had it easy, but one of the big things, you know, go to training camp and that stuff to get your uniforms and your guns, and so one of the big things, photography, had only been around since late 1830s, 1840s, and it had become, you know, very mainstream as far as technology, but not mainstream as a common thing. There were, photography was well established, and most of your towns had a photographer, but individual people having their own camera, unheard of yet. So one of the things they would do in training camp, where they were stationed, was, you know, get their photo taken. These are called CDVs, carte DVs, which basically comes from they're the same site as the visiting cards for the ladies and stuff that, you know, the party. So they CDVs. So if you see one with a tax stamp on the back, you know it's Civil War, 100% from middle 1863 till 1865. So that's the only time they were stamped. A lot of other times you can tell by the borders and stuff. Obviously here we have a soldier. Okay.
You said they were north and south. Were they at the same time in your training camp? Or they didn't know which side they were, or what?
Oh, no, you know, South had their own.
Oh, I thought you said they were both at that training camp. No? Okay.
I might have done with words, I don't know. But, you know, soon they got to the training camps in Iowa, and then most of them went down to Benteen Barracks in St. Louis for their next assignment. But home contact became a big thing. Some of these kids would never see home again. And so, newspapers from home, they wanted letters, and some letters people really like to collect are the ones that have patriotic slogans on the letters or on the envelopes on the outside, and steamer letter and stuff and all that. The United States was using this stamp when the war broke out, but and they kept using it. They were mailed back and forth, and Southerners were using that stamp. Then when the war broke out, they said no. So the U.S. said can't use these stamps anymore. They made new stamps like this. So the South had to start printing their own stamps. They had a postal system down there, but you know, everybody wanted to take along a picture of, you know, mom or their sweetheart or their family or something, or, you know, they would get their photos taken at the camps and send home, and, you know, ask them to please send me one. Two most requested things when they would write home, they wanted stamps and socks. And like I said, shoes were a huge deal. A lot of these regiments, one of the Iowa regiments, they got the camp in St. Louis there, and the next day they had to march way down to southwest Missouri. So they just took off marching. Over half of them didn't have shoes, and you know, they marched all the way diagonally across Missouri in 3 or 4 days to get down to fight in the south down there. And that's the way it was through a lot of the war. You know, provisions on both sides were tough to get, especially as it went on, especially in the south. So after they go to these training camps, and you know, they get sent down to St. Louis area, and from there they get shipped out. They're ready for this big adventure, on to glory. You know, gonna come home and with fancy uniform, the parade, the music's gonna be there, and all the pretty girls are gonna get on the side of the street and stuff. Mom and dad are gonna be waiting with hugs. Maybe not. Okay. Camp life. And I got a question mark because it was that. How much of that, I don't know. In the wintertime, they usually had time to, you know, put up rudimentary wooden structures. And for the most part, fighting stopped in the winter months. You know, nobody wanted to go out. There were some exceptions to that, but for the most part, they they stayed holed up in these areas. Then when spring came and the weather started getting a little nicer, they would start tearing these down, use them for firewood and stuff, and time it so when the firewood was gone, then it was time to move out on the march and go actually to the battlefields. So this kind of camp was permanent camps in between deployments. They weren't the big training camps, but at these camps you had sutlers there that sold all kind, different kind of goods. If you had money to buy new socks, they had those, and you could buy stamps if you had money, and buy a tin can of food if you had money. But not everybody did. Right? Diversions that came about in camp. First time away from home for a lot of these people. Reading the Bible was a big pastime for some people. One regiment had a punishment if you swore you had to read so many minutes or a time period out of the Bible. And if one Iowa soldier wrote back and said the guy in his company, this is still in camp, I don't know, said at this point he's been through the first books of the Bible, and he'll probably have Genesis, whatever, completed by the time we break camp here. So he must have been swearing all the time. Card playing was big. Music was big. Just informal around that. But every regiment had their band with them, and they would play when they marched to keep the spirits up. And they would play in the evenings and stuff. And when they were in long-term camps like this, they just sat around waiting for marching orders, and sometimes they knew it would be going to be 3 months here before we go. Other times it was, well, we'll just wait. We could be called any time to march to the battlefield. Jew's harp, little musical instrument. I don't know. I don't know how they played it. This is a brass reed out of a harmonica. Super common artifact we like to find on the battlefields. So I don't know, from what I've seen of that many recovered, it seemed like half the soldiers must have a harmonica in their pocket, because you find those all over the place. Riding home was a big deal. Getting paper and stuff. If you were in the permanent camps, they had sutlers there that usually had paper and ink. Playing checkers and stuff. Those are musket balls that they've hammered flat to serve as checkers, and they couldn't hammer them back into bullets if the enemy came, but they weren't worried about it. Okay. But along with diversions, vices came in. Some of this harmless card playing. There were card sharks that took advantage of kids, took all their money, and kids didn't have money to buy stamps home. They couldn't buy a treat from the sutlers. They couldn't buy that pair of socks they needed. Foraging is a nice term for taking things that aren't yours. And early in the war, foraging was really not allowed, but it took place and just kind of looked the other way. Later on, foraging became a big part of it, and I don't know the reason behind it, but one of the two things Iowa soldiers were known for is they were good foragers. The Pennsylvania, New York troops, I don't know why, I haven't researched that yet. But again, playing for money and stuff, getting into debt, drinking, alcohol found its way into these camps. I think there were one in every 220 soldiers had a severe alcohol problem and had to be released from the service. Opioids, big use of opioids. Anesthesia and stuff were pretty common and plentiful. We think about all these operations where 5 guys are holding her down or yelling and screaming. No, they had anesthesia and stuff, and that carried over, and they were doing it for pastime or relief from the travails of war, and not just from pain. Prostitution, big problem. 100,000 soldiers got treated for venereal diseases on that. Another 183,000 went to military courts for some kind of unlawful sexual behaviors and stuff. So, but in the established places like New Orleans was taken over real early in the war by the North. Some places in Virginia were taken over early in the North, and in New Orleans, the government regulated it and said, here's where you go. They had to have checkups and stuff to try to keep the soldiers healthy. So a lot of your better prostitutes went there. Some of the other big staging cities, in Maryland and Virginia, after that part was thing, had a lot of prostitutes around. Hooker, they say the term hookers came from General Hooker. He certainly did encourage his men to go to prostitutes and stuff to, whatever relief to keep order in the camp better. But the term was around for 20, 25 years before the Civil War. And England and stuff, a part of hook and grab, hook them in and stuff. They were hookers and other things. Is another slang term. I don't know what the English derivation is, what a hooker means, but okay. Little things. The reality in the field. Once you got out of your camps, and okay, now you're in your little two-man tents. You don't have the big Sibley tents that hold 6-8 people. You don't have the mess wagon coming and the company cooks cooking for you. You're cooking your own food. On the march, you usually had the supply wagons following up, but when they were marching by themselves, they were equipped with 2 days' rations. The typical Civil War soldier was 5'7" to 5'8", and about 143 to 145 pounds, and their average equipment was about 40 pounds that they carried all the time on the march. Early in the war, they were given all kinds of stuff. Raincoats were oil-embedded canvas, very, very heavy. Bayonets and stuff were heavy. After a few weeks or whatever, they started realizing stuff they didn't need. Bayonets were about the first thing to get thrown away or used for hanging pots on in camp and stuff like that. But when you were in the little makeshift camps like we had before, where the things were around and you had the commissaries and supply wagons with you, life was, it wasn't good, but it wasn't as bad. When you took off like this, you were out on your own, and sometimes it took a few days for the commissary wagons to catch up, and the wagons carried coffee, sugar, and a few things like that were distributed to a group. Individual rations, they carried their own. When they went on the march, like I said, I tried to find out the average amount of miles that a Civil War soldier would have walked, and I can't. But when they were marching from one camp, going, to the next engagement, or they're going from, say Tennessee into Pennsylvania or something, they would have big pack wagons behind them, and sometimes these wagons were 60 miles long. And can you imagine going about 4 miles an hour, 5 in good weather? Can you imagine like Tipton? Here troops come through, all the soldiers come through, a few thousands of them, and they get into town, and they all want food, they all want water, they want something, and then they go out, and then 60 miles worth of wagons to come through. The cannons took 6 horses to pull them. The wagons had at least 4 mules to pull them. It typically took about 25 wagons to supply 1,000 soldiers. And that, going from place to place was not good. Like I said, a lot of these soldiers were doing this barefoot. If you had to do, double time or something, it varied. In poor weather, 5-6 miles a day. If it was raining, probably 20 miles a day was average marching time, which is just short of, running a marathon. That's 26 miles. And then you go to camp and you sleep. Those camps were a little short. Their feet always stuck out that, and eating your hardtack and coffee and salt pork or whatever, and then getting up before dawn the next morning and marching another 20 miles, setting up camp, trying to get wood, get a fire to heat your food. Not very good. On what they call forced marches, they did 30 to 40 miles on a march. And they would stop every once in a while, eat some hardtack or have something to drink and then get marching again. They do 30 to 40 miles before they would camp again. And in some extreme things, they would say you're going here to battle, 40 or 60 miles to the next place. You might stop a few times along the way, obviously, to get some water and things like that. But you didn't stop to sleep. You didn't. They may have had short breaks where they could heat up their stuff for food. But the 3rd Iowa Volunteer Infantry, as far as anything I have found out, has the record down in Missouri. They marched 113 miles in 3 days to get close to the battlefield. And again, that was early in the war, and soldiers marched, in the mud, in the rain, sometimes in the snow, barefoot. Sometimes, you go out with a soldier's march, it was, a trail of blood from bloody feet and things. Okay. Well, the real adventure was not what they wanted it to be. They were exposed to the horrors of war. And the biggest horror was disease. Disease killed probably about 2/3 of the soldiers. The other third were war casualties. And just the state of medicine. They didn't know about sanitation. They didn't really know about germs yet. So, surgeons would, saw somebody's leg off, go to the next person, same saw. They wouldn't even wash their hands, same saw somebody else's leg on. They didn't really know how to treat the wounds and keep things out. So that was the first thing. And the next thing that caused death was the battlefield. And the battlefields were horrendous. And even if you weren't killed or wounded, just being on the battlefield was a horrendous experience. I don't think we can imagine. You get out here, thousands of men on side, scattered out, open meadows, in trees, hillsides over there, and you don't know if the enemies come around or they're all in front of you. And once the shooting starts, the sound from the cannons and the gunfire and the smoke, it kind of obliterated everything. Once in a while on the 4th of July, we go to firework things, we sit there, boom, 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 up there, it's really cool, the smoke floats away. But, I don't know, could you imagine a fireworks display, say out in the parking lot, and we're here and there's no building, and it goes on for 8 hours, and it's 50 times more, at least going off, than a fireworks show, and all that smoke and stuff is coming your way. That's the way the battlefields work. And with, wasn't just getting wounded. I mean, here you're a young kid, you've never been 20 miles away from your home, and you're down south someplace and get your first battle. And you're out there and start shooting the horror and stuff. They were, soiling their drawers. They were doing, yelling and screaming. They got wounded. Everybody was crying for mama and stuff. And you'd be running here and look next to you, and literally, the guy next to you would have his head taken off by a cannon shot. It was brutal. And the smoke, you couldn't see in it. Like I said, the bands were there to play the music, to direct things, but once the shooting started, you couldn't hear them. The flag bearers were big for signaling, you know, whose regiment was where, and they're moving, so now we move. But once the smoke started, you couldn't see those. So, you know, people just kind of shot at the smoke, and with the smoke, the effects and things, a lot of them were shot low, just hit the ground in front. But because of the technology of the war, amputations were a big thing. 3/4 of the surgeries, or 3 out of 4, 3/4 of the surgeries done in the war were amputations. And the amputations were actually pretty successful, like right at about 75%, you know, living rate. Some would, you know, later get infections because they didn't know how to deal with that very well and die from that. But the amputations were pretty successful. They were usually well, you know, anesthetized or whatever. Anyway, they had painkiller. But the typical amputation took 3 to 4 minutes. They would pull you in here, you're out of it. They would peel back the skin, reveal the bone, cut the bone off, then this other skin they would pull back up over the bone and sew it or hold it shut, and away you go. And if you didn't get infection, good chance you're going to live. But the limbs, the arms and legs were just thrown into piles outside the tent, and next few days wagons would come and pick up all those rotten limbs and take them and dump them in the nearest creek or maybe bury them someplace. Andrew Jackson famously had his arm amputated. One of the ladies nearby saw his arm laying outside the tent, so she took it and took it back to the family cemetery to bury it, because she didn't think he should have his arm treated like that. So Jackson's buried back in his own place, and his arm is very miles and miles away from him. Boredom, being homesick, you know, your will to fight and stuff, huge problem. You know, what do? You're miserable, you're cold, you're wet, you don't have enough sleep, you don't have much food, and an attack can happen anytime. Can you imagine just the despair? And nothing to do about it. Then you face, you know, capture. Was not a pleasant thing. Early in the war, they had exchanges. You know, they would exchange quite frequently 100 prisoners for 100 prisoners. Sometimes they just had oaths of allegiance, because neither side was not prepared to take care of their armies, let alone feed and house prisoners. So a lot of times, you know, you catch a bunch and, you know, you didn't have much to do with them. You would have them take the oath of allegiance and say, you know, loyal to the U.S., I won't fight against them anymore, and you'd send them home. And a lot of them actually honored the word pretty well, but as it got into the war, it did happen that they stopped prisoner exchanges and stuff, and it was that. Drug addiction became a real problem in the war. You know, you're sickly from other ailments, and you're weak from all the exertion, lack of food and that, and then, you know, the drugs just take an even worse toll. The battlefield, like I said, the battlefield, the carnage they saw, going out and seeing people killed right beside you. Sometimes people just basically hit by a cannon, they just explode next to you, and blood and guts and bones are, sorry, graphic, but war is war. Scattered all over the place. You know, some of the battles, you go in later in the battle, and, you know, you're walking over the dead troops that were shot 2 hours before you, working your way through that, or you're dropping down behind them for a little cover to shoot your guns. Sometimes, you know, it took an ungodly amount of time to get rid of the bodies. Early on, it was probably, when slaves were liberated by the U.S. forces, they were referred to as contraband. which means it is property you have taken from the enemy. So these contrabands were, you know, didn't have any place to go or whatever, so the military just took them in and, you know, pretty much forced them to be cooks and with the supply wagons. The big thing was they were the people who went out and had to pick up things like that and put them on litters and carry them away to the cemetery and bury them. And like I said, for young kids to see this was just terrible on them. Then plus, these are period photographs with photography there. The Civil War was the first photographed war. So images like this got back to the home front. And people really had no idea what war was. Because they always saw, you know, all these soldiers marching off, uniforms, drums and stuff. And, you know, later after World War I, whatever war, when it's over, they come marching back. They're all in their uniforms again. They're happy to be home. And they had really no idea what went on in between it. But when the average Civil War people at home saw photos like this, they just couldn't imagine that this was what war was really like. Okay.
Bernie, I want to make sure we have time for questions.
Okay, what's going on here?
Okay.
No, I said, how long have I?
You've
Seems
been
like
an
15
hour
minutes.
and 20 minutes.
Are you kidding? Okay. Okay, I'll wrap this up. Gangrene was a big thing.
Not that we
Diseases.
haven't enjoyed it, but I just want to make sure we have time for
Mercury poisoning, some of the things did that to bodies. Skip. Go ahead. Food was terrible. Heart attack. They got about a pound of salt pork like that, maybe a pound and a half if it was beef. Heart attack, about a pound of heart attack, or if they had soft ribs, pound and a half. Coffee was about it. Sometimes they did canned foods. Big thing was weaponry. It was so advanced. We went to the rifles instead of muskets. Yeah, it was good. Skip on. We'll just go to the end. But no, go back to that one. Big thing with cannons. They came up with all kinds of things. They had cannon shells. They would load them with big balls like this, different sized ones down to grape shot. These would come out and explode over the things that are in front of people and just scatter. The shells themselves would break. They would fire things like this, put one ball in, and then the chain would start the other ball in. When that came out, you had two cannonballs going down. And there's accounts of, read about one guy named artillery, you know, a cannonball came, like a bowling ball, it hit, and came bouncing and rolling. White just obliterated 3 soldiers right there, and then went on past them and took out 2 horses and continued off into the woods. Okay. Guns, big improvement. There's I got a replica of that gun over there if you want to see that. That's the actual gun there in that picture that shot Lincoln. Okay. Edge weapons, the old idea of the bayonet charges. Now, less than 1% of casualties were caused by bayonets. In this war, you know, if you got close enough to be bayonet range, hardly ever happened. One side would give or the other side would give away. There are a few exceptions where they got close enough to the bayonets, but bayonets were one of the first things they threw away. Go through all these blue ones. These are individual stories about these guys. Sorry, I really had no idea.
I can see
Go
you
back
back
that
for
one.
part 2.
Here's Tipton, Charles Chambers. Anybody remember anything around here with the Chambers name to it? That was the Chambers ancestor that fought in the war. Involved in a number of things after the war around here with businesses and you know, pretty active in the community. But he was in Vicksburg, Tupelo, Nashville, and things when he was in there. He was a surgeon. With medicine, there was about 11,000 northern surgeons 550 of them only had done any kind of surgery work before they went in the military. The South had about 3,500 surgeons, and only 35 of them had ever done an operation before they were in the war. Okay. First, we're about wrapping up. Civil War, tons of firsts. First U.S. government printed paper. First repeating arms, Gatling gun. First using balloons, aerial observation in warfare. It becomes common now. Now we're at spy satellites. First war the telegraph was used to communicate. First war with iron-clad ships. First war with submarines. First war with, they called them torpedoes then. We would call them mines now, but huge, and still out there. First war that troops were transported by rail. First war that they used embankments, and dug in like that, became huge in World War I. Medal of Honor first started in the Civil War by Lincoln. 29 Iowans won that. Okay. Second? Still first. Second. First organized ambulance things of any kind with any kind of a plan to remove wounded soldiers from the battlefield. All previous wars, they went out and fought, and then afterwards, they figured out, well, what do we do now? But they got organized there, and they had people waiting in reserve to do that. Clara Barton, that Red Cross, we still have that with us. First time the draft was installed, we had draft riots. State of New York was thinking for a while of seceding from the Union as well, with business interests. First opioid epidemic after the war. So many ex-soldiers and stuff were drug addicts, become treatment in the war. It was a real problem, but it didn't really spread because after that generation died out, it didn't get transferred on. Another little thing with, first income tax, IRS, still with us. Previous to this, schools were almost always taught by males. During the Civil War, all the men were away, so the women had to take over. So after the Civil War, elementary schools become populated by almost all female teachers. But because the Civil War happened. Okay. The end. Linear effects. I think there's another one. Oh, no. I guess it's it. Thank you very much. Sorry, took so much time. Literally, 20 minutes in my mind has gone by. But thank you for your patience. I encourage you to go and look at some of the stuff I brought. If you want to hold a real Civil War newspaper or look at, handle real money or whatever, it's all over there. Pick up a gun or wield a sword. I asked one time if they could shoot a percussion caps in here. I don't know. You could go outside and you could fire a dare to shot Lincoln. All that's there is a percussion cap, not a powder load. You see how loud that is. But thank you for your attention. Apologize for taking too long. Still get home and play some of the basketball games.